Hello and welcome back to Book by Book, the joy of meeting Jesus in all the scriptures. My name's Steve Nichols and it's great to have you with us for study 7 in Paul's letter to the Romans. 7,000 words that have changed the world. Well, we want to learn from God together, so please join us in our study. And helping us today are Dr. Joanna Hargreaves, pastor, psychotherapist and writer. Jo, great to have you here. You write under the name The Faith-Filled Therapist.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us. Also, Dr. Paul Blackham, a theologian, church planter and church minister. And Tobias Brown, originally from Chicago, but now the senior pastor of Grace Church Broccoli. Thank you for our time together. It's going to be great. I'm looking forward to our study. We saw last time in Romans 9 that all God's plans and purposes are about trusting in Jesus. In fact, we've seen that throughout the whole letter. There's salvation for anyone who trusts in Christ, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. But what of those Jews who don't believe? Well, Paul doesn't shrug his shoulders as if he doesn't care about them. Let's join him in chapter 10 and read a few verses together. Pick up a Bible if you have one, turn to Romans chapter 10, and we'll read from verse 1. Paul writes, "Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Israelites is that they may be saved. For I can testify about them that they are zealous for God, but their zeal is not based on knowledge. Since they did not know the righteousness that comes from God and sought to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. Christ is the end of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes." Tobias, I wonder if I could begin with you. And with that last phrase, Christ is the end of the law. How is Christ the end of the law? What does that mean?
Yeah, before I get to that phrase, I just want to just highlight just how much Paul prayed for the salvation of his people. I mean, here he is. He's just so concerned for their well-being, for them being made right with God, because they're still seeking salvation through the law. So he's going back to chapters 2 and 3, and he's addressing the religious people, the folks who think that they could be made right with God by their performance. And so what he's saying by this phrase is that Christ is the end of the law as a way of righteousness, as a way of being accepted to God. And he's like, man, I really hope and pray that my people see Jesus for who he really is, that they stop trying to base their righteousness off of the law and look to Christ. He is the end of the law. He is the fulfillment of all the law points to.
That's helpful. He's the purpose, he's the end goal.
He's the purpose, he's the end goal. Yeah. Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Tobias, thank you. Jo, can I turn to you? Verses 5 onwards, Paul quotes from the law of Moses. Moses describes in this way the righteousness that is by the law. The man who does these things will live by them, but the righteousness is by faith, says, do not say in your heart, and so on. And he quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 30. Do Paul and Moses really say the same thing? Does Moses really preach the same gospel as Paul?
Yeah, really interesting. And actually, as I was looking back at 9, where we were in the last episode, we see that Paul he talks about great sorrow and continual grief in his heart. Like Tobias said, he cares so deeply for these people, to the point that he says, "For I could wish that I myself were accursed from Christ." And we know that Moses says something similar. He has a similar burden for his people, where he says, if my name could be blotted out of the book of life, so you guys could inherit this. And so I see definitely they have the same burden there. And essentially, I do think they preach the same gospel. Going into Deuteronomy 30, we see Moses do almost this brilliant motivational speech, and we love those nowadays, don't we? This motivational speech of all the things that that they could do all the things that they could do to live right and to be right. But then at the end, he kind of summarised by saying, but you're going to mess up and you're not going to do any of these things and you can't do any of these things. And that's very similar to what Paul says of like, it is by faith. It's by faith, it's by trusting. So I think it's, I think it's a similar message. And if I can segue a little bit, if I can. So I'm looking at now in 1 John 4, and I know it's a bit of a jump, but here we hear this just gorgeous verse that says, there's no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. And I'm thinking, how is this outworking in both Moses and in Paul's body? Because we know that they are consumed, that they're burdened with this stuff. They'd have been feeling the stress. And because they're humans, this stress would have outworked in their physical body in the same way it does in ours. So they'd have had some adrenaline and some cortisol. Now, often when we're so burdened and full of that concoction of adrenaline and cortisol, we don't think straight, we're not very grounded, we're not very eloquent. And yet we see Moses and Paul being incredibly eloquent, really delivering a great message, even though they're burdened. And this just reminds me of how the gospel operationalizes in our physical body, because despite this cortisol they'd have had, we think we can go to this verse, the one that we see in John, and we see that perfect love casts out fear. When we feel loved, we're full of oxytocin. The thing you have when you have a baby, you get it from eating chocolate, you feel full of oxytocin. And it's the same principle, perfect love casts out fear, oxytocin eats up cortisol. So whatever stress they'd have been feeling, I just summarise that they would have both known they were incredibly loved because they're grounded. Their nervous system is grounded. They're able to speak eloquently. And I just love that. So they're not trying to get us in on a club. They're just telling us, we want you to experience the deep love that we've experienced. And I just find that, I can relate to that so much in there. I love it.
That's wonderful. That's so interesting, Joe. Thank you. Paul, anything you'd add as we look at this?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to beat that. But it's just to underline, they were on the same page, Moses and Paul. And I just like, I think it's in Acts 26:22, where Paul's speaking, is it to Felix or somebody? And he just says, I'm not saying anything different to what Moses was saying and the prophets. So he's like, no, we're all on the same page. We're all saying just... And then actually Moses at the end of Deuteronomy 30 just says, look, you love this Lord with everything you've got, I guess because he loves you with everything he's got. So it's that lovely idea that don't worry about whether you're zealous or getting it all right. What you really need to do is, love him because he already loves you.
Wonderful. Paul, can I stay with you?
Yeah.
And just as we look down at verses 14 and 15, how then can they call on the one they've not believed in? How can they believe in the one of whom they've not heard? How can they hear without someone preaching to them? Paul, are there people who have never heard of Jesus? We often say, what about the person who's never heard of Jesus?
Yeah.
Are there people who've never heard of Jesus?
Well, I guess there's some people maybe not that actual name, but that person, the God the Son, the Logos who holds everything together, the divine mediator, him, no, there isn't. And then people, because I love the fact Paul just goes, hey, what does Psalm 19 say? And when you look up Psalm 19, it's, again, because he just says, no, everyone's heard. Their voice has gone out to the whole earth, their words to the ends of the world. And sometimes when people are looking at Romans 10, they think, oh, does he mean like some gospel preachers, like apostles or something like that? No, he doesn't mean that. Psalm 19 just says, like the sun, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands, day after day pouring forth speech. And then he gives an example of like the sun. And it's like that way, the sunrise in the morning, and darkness is defeated. And he says that's like a bridegroom, a champion going out, and darkness is defeated. And he's almost like saying, if anyone who's seen the sunrise knows there's a divine champion who will fight for them, and they only need to just call out, almost as if the body wants to call out. And when you've been in the night and you're testing of the night and everything's got on top of you, and then the sun rises and you're like, nah, it's okay. And he goes, that is like the gospel. Like you should just respond to that and call out to the one who made all this. Or we've thought about like seeds are another example, death and resurrection. And there's just so many of them all around us. So in a way, Paul's like saying, no, look, even if no evangelist gets to a person and they never, actually the creation is an evangelist and they really only need to respond to the world around them. Or there's that lovely verse in Job where it's like, ask the animals, they'll tell you. Isn't that a good verse, that one? As if like, I talk to your dog or something. But actually the animals know, and they, like Jesus said, look at the birds, they know. So it's as if it's so easy to do this. It's like harder not to trust him than to trust him. Yeah.
Wonderful. The old Puritans, I mean, they wrote great books on how creation preaches the gospel, didn't they? And it's worthy of a whole program, a whole series on its own.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got to move on. So we're in chapter 11, verses 1 to 15. Has God rejected Israel completely? I suppose that's our question. Tobias, verses 2 to 4 of chapter 11, Paul goes back to Elijah. How does Paul go back to people that God knew in the past to get hope for Israel in the present, thinking of Elijah's experience?
Yeah, the whole Elijah analogy is a brilliant analogy because, again, if you look at 1 Kings 19, when Elijah was prophesying, again, he was prophesying to a group or to a nation who had abandoned God. They had abandoned God for Baal worship. And here is Elijah. He is prophesying, and he just feels like he's all by himself. He feels like he's the only one doing God's work, and God has to tell him, like, no, these people may have abandoned me, but there are 7,000 others that I have reserved for myself. There is a remnant of believers. So what Paul is trying to do is he's trying to give people hope by saying God always has worked with a remnant. So it doesn't really matter if the nation has really, God still has his people. And that's why I think Paul is trying to do. He's trying to give them hope by showing and saying, like, I'm part of that remnant. And you can be a part of that remnant as well. So I'm a Jew, but yet God has opened my eyes to see the wonderful promises of the scriptures being fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And so he's going back to Elijah to say, God didn't reject Elijah, and God didn't reject the 7,000 other prophets who he had reserved for himself. He has always had a remnant of people.
He's always had a remnant. Yeah. Joe, if I can sort of following on from that, as we look down verses, I suppose, verse 5 onwards, why did so many Israelites miss out on the gospel? Where did they go wrong?
Do you know what? In 2 Peter 3:16, it says, Paul's letters are hard to understand. And I really relate to Peter. I'm like, there's various things I relate to Peter on, I relate to him on that. I find it hard to understand. I'm going to be really honest. I know that, I mean, again, I'm going to take a little bit from Corinthians of like where we're called to believe the best. There's part of me that thinks, okay, they're so zealous, they're so into kind of monotheism that they think that anything outside of that is idolatry. So, you know, if I was going to believe the best, you know, I can see that going on. But I'm just going to have to pull the Peter card on this and say, and maybe someone can answer it better, these letters are hard to understand. I don't know. I think we can get, again, we mentioned in a previous episode, we can get so fixed on our own perception of things, we forget the bigger perspective, we're not open to the bigger perspective, we get caught in confirmation bias that whatever we think, whatever we tell ourselves to be true, we see it out in reality. So whatever they saw, but then I think, well, that poses a different question. Why was Paul different? Why was the remnant different? It's always an interesting question.
I think it's interesting, like when you say, I don't know why they didn't believe. In a way, Jesus says that, isn't there? There's that time where what amazes Jesus, it's like, there was one time he's amazed that the centurion, with the faith of the centurion, he's like, I can't believe this guy, because he's like a pagan guy, but he believes. But there's that other time when he's amazed by their unbelief. And you think, well, how can he be amazed? Surely he understands everything and he knows why everything is. And he's like, yeah, I just don't know why people don't trust me. And I think there is a way in here where it's like it's a stupor, it's a foolishness, it's an irrational thing. And in a way, the Lord's like saying, look, if you're going to be like that and you're not going to trust me, you're just not going to be able to see properly. You're harming yourself. It's foolish. There is no reason. And I just love the fact, like you're saying in a way, Jesus is like, I don't know why they don't trust me. It doesn't make any sense. Why should, or even the Lord sometimes says, why will you die? Why will you die? Please don't. And yet, I don't know why you're doing this. So I think that's a good answer, actually, that there is no reason for it, really. It's madness, isn't it?
Yeah.
So is there hope still for Israel? How can Israel be saved? That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah, because like, did they stumble so far that they've gone beyond recovery? So is it that? And that's the question he's concerned about. Like, there's no hope for them. Then they've rejected the gospel so often. It's like that's it. They're done. And he's like, no, it isn't like that. There's always a way back. And that's, in a way, that's the whole message of this chapter, really. He's like saying, no, they have done this, and maybe it doesn't make any sense. It's stupid. It's irrational. Why have they done that? But the Lord's always saying, and he has this imagery down from verse 22, and when he's getting into this picture of a tree kind of a thing. And he's like, okay, so Gentile people, they're saved. But he's like, there's always room for the original Israel people. There's always room. The door, and he's going to say the door's always open to the end of time. There's always the door open. Don't ever write anybody off. Don't write anybody off, and especially not people who've got so many reasons to believe.
Yeah.
Go on, Tobias, take that on for us then. What's this gardening image that he has of the olive tree with some branches broken off, others grafted in, and room for the original branches to be grafted back in? What's that all about?
Yeah, I think what Paul is warning against is pride.
Yeah.
I think he's warning against believing that just because that you believe the gospel and that the people who were the original recipients of the covenant, many of them have fallen off and been cut off because of he's saying, no, be warned, because the same unbelief that happened to them can happen to you. And so he's saying, don't really look at your salvation as being something that you are entitled to, because it still comes down to faith in the gospel, faith and belief in the gospel. And so when I spent these past few days trying to understand this and that, because I'm like, man, Steve gave me an analogy that really doesn't work for a city boy. I'm trying to figure out, like, what is this? So I started looking on. So the idea is that God saves some and gives them life, and then he takes them and he puts them in the original olive branch so it can flourish even more, so it can produce more life. And so that stump or that root that he's talking about is the inheritance. It's all of the promises of God's covenant people that we have been grafted into. And what Paul is saying, don't become arrogant and foolish that you've been grafted in, but fear God, worship him, be thankful. Because, and tremble, verses 20. And so that's what I think he's trying to do.
And so often the Bible has this imagery of, like, well, Jesus says, like, I'm the true vine, your branches. But if branches don't bear fruit, the Father's the gardener, and he'll come and get rid of them. So it's exactly, Paul probably got that in the back of it. He's nicking it off Jesus. But I think he's happy. He's happy to admit that, I'm sure, that he nicks everything off Jesus. But it's all the way through the Old Testament too, isn't it? Like an olive tree and fig tree and things. And this idea of the church is like that, and there's branches. And so when Paul does this, he's tapping into, well, really Jesus, but it's all great. It's all the way back.
Joe, anything you would add to that? The warnings or the encouragements, the promises in these verses?
I just find it all beautiful. I find it all beautiful. I just think it's such a good compass for the human experience, isn't it? That God's given us that, don't get proud, don't assume, don't think you've got it all together. And it's, for me, again, it's a bit of a reminder to walk out our salvation with fear and trembling, that we just think, okay, don't get too proud. Don't think that you've got it all nailed. And it's just this again, a beautiful reminder of our reliance on God, the way we need to trust him, cleave to him, cling to him at times, and that faith and trust are just essentially what we've been created for. So, yeah, I find it a stark warning, but also it's kind of this paradox, this warning, but also really comforting at the same time.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Paul, if we look on to verse 25, 26, Paul, the Apostle Paul writes, Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in, and so all Israel will be saved. What does that mean? How will all Israel be saved?
All Israel. Well, some people go, like, remember, when way back in chapter 9, verse 6, he says, like, all Israel is not Israel. And he's like saying there's two meanings to Israel. And so sometimes people read that and they'll say, by Israel there, he means genetic people who are descended. They'll all be saved. People who are genetically related to Abraham. And you're like, well, hang on a minute. Have you not even been reading a single thing he said? He's been trying to tell you for 2 chapters, that doesn't matter. That is not what God's interested in. And then people go, yeah, but maybe he is in the end. And you're like, oh, shut up. Of course that can't.
It's 144,000.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And they'll suddenly go, but, okay, pretend I haven't listened to anything that he said. No, do listen to what he's been saying. He's just been trying to argue. It's not about that. And Jesus said that to people in John 8. So when he says all Israel here, he can't be saying all people who have the right genes. No, he's saying, remember what Israel means to God. It means like anyone can be a wrestler with God. Someone who engages with God. He's been arguing that, whether you're pagan or not, or Jewish, it's open for anybody. So he's like saying, look, at the end, what God's got, this dream of this tree that's got all kinds of different branches and fruit and flowers, and it's beautiful, and all these, so many people different. He's like, that is how it's going to be. No one's, if you're trusting Jesus, you're in on this, whether you're Jewish, Gentile, anything. And in the end, all of that Israel's going to be saved. The Israel that he was making promises about, because remember, you introduced it and said, God's made all these promises about Israel. Has he broken them? No. The Israel that he's thinking about, he won't have broken any promises, because that Israel is defined by trusting in Jesus, the Christ. And no, that is all Israel from that definition will be saved, none lost.
That's good.
It's a tree that fills the whole earth. In other parts of the Bible, isn't it? Everyone finds their place. Wonderful. Tobias, as we sort of come into land, at the end of the chapter here, verse 32, chapter 11, verse 32, for God has bound all people over to disobedience, so that he may have mercy on them all. It's kind of a summary of almost the whole letter, would you say?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Indeed it is. It's mercy is available to all people, Jews, Gentiles, disobedient, and their disobedience plays a part in God's redemptive plan. And so I believe that Paul bursts into praise just being overwhelmed with the wisdom of it all. The wisdom of God. It's almost as if his brain had tapped out into probing into the depths of the mystery of the gospel. And all he has now is this doxology. All he has now, wow, just thinking about it, like, wow. Oh, the beauty and the wonder and the riches of God. His ways are unsearchable. Who can understand them? And so I believe this is a beautiful summary of this chapter. And I think for us, just practically speaking, when we get to a place where we are just in awe at what God is doing, when we maybe don't understand all that God is, this should be our posture. It should be a posture of praise. Just thanking God for his wisdom. Your ways are higher than my ways. I can't fully understand it, but all I can do is just praise you for it.
Oh, Tobias, thank you. That's the way he's done it, and he doesn't need our feedback. We just stand back and praise him.
Absolutely.
Oh, we've got to stop there, I think. What a place to end. Joe, Paul, Tobias, thank you so much for your time, for your help today to understand these mighty chapters. Thank you. Well, we covered a lot today, and you may want to go back and read through those chapters again yourself. But our key truth, I think, is this. God has bound everybody over to disobedience so that he may have mercy on us all. You don't have to understand everything before you can become a Christian. You don't actually have to understand very much at all. The promise from Joel chapter 2 is simply, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. I wonder, is there something stopping you from giving your life to God? The thought perhaps you've still got lots of questions or you don't feel what you think you should. You know, we'll never understand everything or feel the right thing. Just call out to the Lord, help, call out to him and be saved. And join that olive tree Paul described, the international family of Jesus Christ. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Lord Jesus, I call out to you today. Save me, Lord. I've got lots of questions and maybe things have happened in the past that mean I've held back from trusting you. And maybe I'm not in the right place and I don't have the right feelings, whatever they are. But I call out to you today as best I know how. Lord, save me. Fill me with your Spirit. And send me other Christians who can help me as I give my life to you and join your family. Amen. If you've prayed that prayer, do get a Bible and start reading and ask God to help you understand. And go to church so you can meet other Christians and learn from God's word together. And we'll meet again at our next program. So until then, God bless you and goodbye.